Well, good afternoon. I'll try to get good afternoon. Wow, is it the sunshine that's slowing us down a little bit? Well, anyway, we're glad you're here today for the third part in Milton Historical Society 2018 lecture series. My name is John McWilliams. I'm hosting our series and our speaker today. Bear with me for a few minutes, if you will, for a couple or three public service announcements. First, on your way in, I hope someone gave you or you picked up a half-sheet survey asking about these lectures. Really would appreciate that. Appreciate if you could take 2 or 3 minutes, maybe give some thought to in terms of the venue, time of day, whatever. So we're still trying to figure the right combination here, kind of a learning curve as we go. But most important, we're interested in speakers and their topics because we want to give you a reason to want to come here on Sunday afternoons if we continue on Sunday afternoons. And also, I don't know if I made clear on the survey, but don't feel, if you haven't already handed it back in that little basket out there or whatever, don't feel restricted in terms of the speaker for him or her to be someone either locally or even within the state of Pennsylvania. I mean, if there's, and ideally someone who might have broad appeal. Okay, that's what we're looking for. And again, I hope you understand, we can't guarantee that we will have your request, your selection here next year, but we will do what we can. Okay? Also, there is forms out there on the table. I don't know if you picked them up or not, with a Milton Historical Society banquet that is roughly about 3 weeks away, Thursday, April 5th at 6 o'clock at Winebrook Golf Club. Unlike these first 3 lectures, that one is not free. That's $25, but hey, what a bang for your buck if you do that, because you get a meal and you get to see your friends and chat them up a bit while you're there, and you're going to hear another terrific speaker, Randall Miller from St. Joseph University in Philadelphia, whose topic is the Civil War, and who doesn't like to talk about or listen to something on the Civil War? But he's coming at this topic, the Civil War, with, I think, a rather unique perspective, in that it's not going to be so much about fighting in generals and battles and strategy and such, because there's been so much done on that anyway, as you well know, documentaries and whatever. He's going to look at sort of a generation or two, as I understand it from talking with him, on how Americans were looking back at the Civil War. Sort of like how it might apply to us now in 2018 as we tend to look back on Vietnam, for example, generation or two past. So that will be worthwhile. And maybe even most important about the banquet in 3 or so weeks is that it helps the Milton Historical Society provide services to the community and this lecture series. So we like to think it's a win-win all the way around, and we hope you do too. Okay? Let's see, that's that. And I want to be sure and thank Carol Yorty and her custodial and tech support staff here at the high school for setting up for our speakers. This is the 3rd time they've done that. And John, who is taping all this for us and keeping for prosperity these lectures. And, of course, Superintendent Kathy Keegan, again, for making this facility available to us. So we couldn't do it without us. We were thinking all along that this might be the best site, the best venue for this, but again, on that survey that we're asking for your input, if you've got another suggestion, please let us know. Okay? When I started thinking about this topic, I naturally started thinking about driving and car crashes, because this has something to do with that. And I suspect any one of you can relate to that a bit here as well. and what it was like driving around in Milton. Well, for me, a few years ago. I can't stretch that much because the people here know me too long. I just, as much as I would like to fudge them, I just can't do it. But we had, I just think about the whole process of, turning 16 was our first rite of passage, at least it was for me as I remember, and that's a pretty big deal. 16, and you get a driver's test, driver's license, right? Remember, some of you are, you can remember that, Tim, right? Driver's license, right? You know how that works. And you study, you answer a few questions, how many feet apart from a fire hydrant, all that really valuable, critical information that you're going to recall so many times later. You did it. And then you actually have to go to, for me, I went to Montoursville. How many of you did that? Went to Montoursville? Okay, all right. Okay, Now, here's what struck me about that particular experience. So I'm driving a little bit, we drive a little bit, whatever, we get a kind of hang of it, and then we go to Montoursville to take a test, because if we pass this test, then that means, well, 16, that means we are free. That is independence. Head out on the highway, right? All that, okay? So there's a lot riding on this. So you go to the test from Montoursville, and you get in the car with a state police officer, as I remember. Is that how you do this? Okay. And you drive around this course, probably no more than 20 or 25 miles an hour. Now think about this, right? It reminds me something of one of those rides at Canoble's Grove or Disney World, right? And you park and you do this, that, and make a 3-point turn, which is illegal. So anyway, all right, and then you go back and then stamp, bang, you got a license. You're good to go. That's it. Didn't drive in dark. Didn't drive in the rain. Would never go up there to do that then. Didn't drive in snow. Didn't drive in traffic. And you're 16 years old. So here I am a few years later, almost terrified. I try not to think about it, that there could be a 16-year-old coming at me in the opposite direction at 50 or 60 miles an hour. That's almost terrifying. But the thing of this, at least we had to demonstrate some proficiency to get that license. So imagine an era where there were no licenses. There was no training. The roads, such as they were, oftentimes were dirt. And for a long time. And it made it so much more interesting, so much more of an adventure to be driving out and about there. Well, that's in part what we're going to be hearing about this afternoon, and more, another perspective on this was, again, how the media covered that, because this was kind of brand new for us. The automobile, I mean, if you can just imagine this, well, we can't. We are not that old. I mean, we always grew up with an automobile, so it was always there. But for a generation, roughly around the turn of the 20th century, so this is brand new. I mean, this is a very brand new mode of transportation. It's not just a faster train or faster wagon or canal. This is a brand new. We haven't seen anything like this before. It's sort of, to me, and I think, as revolutionary, perhaps in the way that the computer has been for us now, 100 years later, at the turn of the 21st century. I mean, take it for granted anymore. I mentioned a few minutes ago about why, at least one reason why a driver's license was so important for us at 16 years old, because it absolutely, literally was independence that we had not known or experienced prior to that point in our lives. So when you go back again into the 1900 teens or so, when the automobile is becoming more prevalent, more mass consumption, get into assembly lines a little bit later and all that, but here people, this is literally a game changer in every sense of the word. It changed people's lives and it changed people's lifestyles. The automobile literally touched about every facet, every segment of the American economy. Or to reverse that, imagine your lives now without an automobile. But we wouldn't be here today. Not likely. Not likely. Any of you come from more than 5 miles? Okay, just one. So we're close. We're up. Okay, but that's a day's journey we're talking about, perhaps. So that was not going to happen. Didn't happen. Anyway. So, a cultural phenomenon, if you will. And that's what we're going to be treated to this afternoon. I met our speaker recently last fall in October in Scranton at historians get together for Pennsylvania Historical Association, PHA. And when you go to these things, whether they're statewide or on a national level, there's always a program. And so you have a chance as a spectator, if you will, to decide which county you want to go to. And sometimes this can be a tough decision because there are several going on in the same time slot. And obviously you can't be the same place, the same 2 or 3 places at the same time. So you make a decision, and as soon as I saw the topic here, that caught my eye. And plus I was there sort of scouting around for possible good people for our lecture series, and I said, I'd like to check this out. But not only are we interested in topics, the subject matter, we also want to provide for you a speaker, and someone who can relate and make the subject come alive for you. And so I sat through that, and I think we have a perfect match here. And Professor Ed Slavishak is a native of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He earned his PhD from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He's been a member of the Department of History at Susquehanna University for 15 years, where he teaches courses on the Civil War and American experience, work and play in the USA, and the long Civil Rights Movement. He is also the chairperson of the History Department, and he coordinates the university's Museum Studies program. He's the author of 2 books, one which will be published in June, and he has a 3rd underway, which will explore the early age of, surprise, surprise, automobiles in semi-rural areas like Susquehanna Valley. And this afternoon, he will share with us the significance of turned turtle, early car crashes in the Susquehanna Valley. Please give a warm welcome to Mr. Slavishak.
Thank you for that warm welcome. It's great to be here, and I think I'm going to test your definition of what broad appeal really means. I'm not going to get morbid. It could be morbid. I'm not going to get gruesome or too detailed in any of these car crashes. Car crashes as a topic, I guess, is necessarily a little morbid. It's certainly sad. There's going to be a lot of stuff on the screen, so if I'm blocking you, if you can't see the screen, this might be a moment to change to seats, but otherwise I'm going to go right in. What you see right now on the screen, in addition to my name, are the names of 9 students who have been instrumental in this research. About 3 years ago, I got into the idea of looking at local history. I'm not a native of the area, and my research interests have been further afield. So about 3 years ago, I got into the concept of local history, but the idea of what topic I would study was a big mystery to me. Over the course of a few months, starting 3 summers ago, with several students' help, using local newspapers and local court documents, I kind of seized upon the idea of cars and car crashes as a topic that I could study. It's actually students who wanted me to do it first. I thought that it was the distraction that was kind of keeping me away from something bigger and better. But I discovered that a lot of local history has been covered in some ways. A lot of topics have been covered in some ways. And once you look at newspapers and court documents, that special pair, you start to see that the prevalence of car crashes is something you just can't deny. If you're thinking about the early 20th century, car crashes were happening all the time. And they might have been some minor, some more major than others, but they were happening a lot. And so students pushed me into thinking about this as a topic. Those 9 students are the people who get some great credit toward both doing the grunt work of finding newspaper articles, digging through and digitizing court records, but then also giving me the inspiration to think about car crashes as a possible topic. So what have we been doing for the past 3 years? One of the ways we've been thinking about car crashes is by thinking in terms of a map. And so we have been, and this map is actually online, and I'm happy to share the address with you if you're interested in further information on this. It's a map of the local region, and it is mapping local car crashes that we're finding, again, in newspapers and in court documents. And what it's allowed us to do, this is a very basic first step for us, but what it's allowed us to do is think about indexing the prevalence and the locations of car crashes. And you wouldn't be surprised to learn that the most car crashes happen on the more heavier traffic roads And so the map of these crashes looks like the major road arteries. That wouldn't be surprising. But something that it's allowed us to do, this is Selinsgrove, something that it's allowed us to do is think about the types of accidents that occurred during the time. And these, again, wouldn't be earth-shattering. They wouldn't change your life thinking about these categories. You know these categories exist, but they've allowed us to think about the prevalence, again, the frequency of these accidents. So a single car accident, a car runs off the road, hits a tree. Multi-car accidents, cars hit each other head-on, a car sideswipes another, somebody passes and knocks somebody off the road, etc. Cases involving pedestrians, small road, middle of nowhere kind of accidents, but also accidents in towns involving pedestrians. Horses, these become less common over time, but in the teens, car crashes involving horses were quite prevalent. Car crashes involving trains and trolleys are certainly happening in the more populated areas of the valley. And then finally, those involving commercial trucks. Right? A truck is hauling something to somewhere, and it runs off the road, it smacks into a pedestrian, whatever it might be. That load of stuff runs into the street. This is a first way of us thinking about what we might do with this material. And you'll notice it's not very sophisticated, right? It's counting things and then mapping them. So what you're going to hear now, today, is one of the first attempts to tell stories about this material and package this material in a better way to think about the meaning behind all of these separate incidences of car crashes. So this presentation is about the way in which the automobile sent the world spinning topsy-turvy in the first 3 decades or first 2 generations of drivers in the 20th century. I'm especially interested in car crashes as a unit of analysis and the way in which they allow modern researchers to capture aspects of everyday life, aspects of life that weren't often written about by people who lived them, except maybe in private correspondence, but aspects of everyday life that are written about in relationship, in tangential relationship to these car crashes, particularly, again, in newspapers and in court records. So when a car traveling at high speed crashed into another car or a train or a bridge above them, that car might flip over onto its roof. Writers of the time period referred to that as turning turtle. And I think it's a good metaphor for the way the world seemed to flip end over end for the first generations of drivers. Today I'll think about 2 main ways in which the world turned turtle between 1910 and 1940. First, there were the crashes themselves, the frequency and ferocity of which made people believe that life was getting more dangerous, or at least less predictable in the auto era. Auto accidents injured and killed, certainly, but they also challenged existing social relationships and forced people to adapt to a world that was both expanded and restricted. That sense of freedom when you get your license, but the added burdens that come with operating a car, running a car, having passengers in your car. And second, I'll consider booze, because the emergence of car culture piggybacked the submergence of bootlegging and rum running during the Prohibition era. Some of the most wide-reaching automobile mishaps were just the tips of pretty big icebergs that, when revealed, showed the hidden world kept out of view of the authorities, but seemingly widely whispered about. Car incidents had a way of bringing attention to the people involved, unwanted attention. Cars were machines that helped people get away from home, perhaps, but they also helped people get away with things. And so I want to think about rum running during the 20s and how cars were involved and how car crashes were involved in those things. So newspaper readers in the central Susquehanna Valley couldn't have escaped frequent reminders of the dozens of ways in which people hurt themselves and others in their cars. They drove into each other head-on. They ran down pedestrians morning and night. They knocked over cyclists, motorcyclists, and horses. They skidded over embankments and slammed into trees. They were sideswiped by bread trucks, dragged by freight trains. They spun off bridges into the Susquehanna. In terms of framing the issue of auto risk, the raw count of accidents mattered less than the frequency with which they appeared in the press. As jury selection showed, many locals talked about accidents long before they knew they'd have to sit in judgment. Every court case involving cars in the teens and 20s started with jury selection, of course. The counsel for the defense always opened by asking potential jurors if any of them were opposed to the use of automobiles on the public highway. and they'd get some yeses. Or if any of them had, quote, trouble with the owners of automobiles. Several people were usually dismissed at this point. They'd been around enough to know how motorists were, right? The teens and 20s. And then more people were typically dismissed from these court cases as jurors for having heard of the accidents, talked about the accidents, and formed opinions about the accidents. And so I say that cars are embedded in social relationships, and car crashes too are embedded in social relationships. They're about technology, certainly, they're about access and economics, certainly, but they're embedded in these webs of social relations. And to show this, I'm going to start small, and for me, starting local. I'm going to start on Sand Hill Road, just south of Selinsgrove, in 1914. On a Thursday night in May 1914, there was a church music festival in Sunbury. The Reverend Henry Jonas Kraushaar and his wife Mabel drove a large touring car from their home in Freeburg to the festival in Sunbury and back home. They returned after dark. Kraushaar had just been installed 2 weeks earlier at the Freeburg Lutheran Church, and he was still the news of the town. After Henry had driven through Selinsgrove and made the sharp right turn on the Sand Hill Road, he accelerated to get up and over the hill. They never made it. Reverend Kraushaar had only a few weeks of driving, so his time in town was 2 weeks, and that was exactly how long he'd been driving, 2 weeks worth of driving experience at the time. And he didn't anticipate that a deep gutter running diagonally across the road would turn his wheels violently when he ran over it. So the gutters were called thank you ma'ams. Sometimes bumps were called thank you ma'ams because they made drivers' heads bob and it looked like you were offering a polite gesture to the road. Kraushaar's car swerved to the right because of this gutter, and when he tried to compensate by turning to the left, he flipped the car. The car turned over. So the papers had a turned turtle on their hands. Both 26-year-old Mabel and 35-year-old Henry were caught under the wrecked car. Although they got Henry out pretty quickly, local residents took more than an hour to get Mabel out of the wreckage. She suffered scalp lacerations, a sprained ankle, and complained of pain all over. Some local papers at first reported that her back was broken. Most reporters reported that her injuries were fatal. Mabel Kraushaar actually wasn't that badly injured, not as badly injured as that. She just cut her head and she'd injured her legs. She was on crutches for a while, but she recovered. So while it was a cataclysmic event, certainly in the lives of these two individuals, this crash on the southern end of Selinsgrove in 1914 was a minor bump in the road in the grand scheme of things. But note how it introduces us to a few points about early car culture. First, the road system in 1914 was a patchwork quilt of new macadam roads, improved dirt roads, farm paths, railroad lines, trolley tracks, bridges, steep ridges, blind curves, and rough drainage ditches. Henry Kraushaar didn't know what to expect when he hit a thank you man at high speed, and high speed here would have been 15, maybe 20 miles per hour. And county and borough, and certainly state officials, didn't yet see it as their duty to do much to protect motorists beyond warning them. So the newspapers, the Selinsgrove Times included, they covered the accident by stressing that this was a dangerous spot. This eastern end of Sand Hill on the southern end of town was a dangerous spot, and that drivers should take precautions. Beyond that, there wasn't yet much of a sense that authorities or tastemakers should be protecting people from themselves. Second, driving in 1914 had opened up the world. Before the emergence of cars, a resident of Freeburg, like the Kraushaars, might have chosen to go to a music festival in Sunbury, but it would have taken either a horse ride, a carriage ride, a walk into Selinsgrove, and then a trolley ride across the river. Cars allowed this couple to contemplate that 22-mile round trip as something they could do in an evening. Third, crashes were front-page news, and front-page news in a regional sense. All of the local papers covered this crash, and because they had just come, the Kraushaars had just come from Allentown, all the Allentown papers and even the Bethlehem papers covered the crash. And because Henry was a minister and thus a public figure, the Harrisburg papers covered the story as well. Some local reporters guessed that Mabel would recover, led papers, newspaper editors and writers statewide to reporting that she was doomed. Single car accidents like this were, of course, just one of the 4 common types of accidents of this era. that era, but also, I suppose, this era as well now. There were multi-car accidents, usually caused by the tendency of early drivers to hog the middle of the road. Everybody was afraid, for good reason, of dropping off the side of the road into a ditch. And so everybody tended to lean toward the middle. They had to be told repeatedly to drive on the right, stick to the right. There were also accidents involving pedestrians, usually again during rain or fog when visibility was low, or in the crowded, busy streets of places like Shamokin, Sunbury, or Lewisburg. Finally, there were accidents between cars and trains or trolleys. Trolley accidents with cars were pretty common. Train accidents less so, but they were the most reported, most sensational of all types of accidents. And so media coverage of train car accidents was really off the charts. And that's what brings us to Milton. So specifically, I want to think about Milton and its railroad crossings during a 2-year period between 1924 and 1926. The town was the scene of 4 fatal crossings or crossing accidents during this time period. And it gained Milton a reputation for being a place where motorists had to be particularly on their guard. With the Pennsylvania Railroad tracks running north and south to the east of town, there are several spots at which cars and trains could come into contact. So Milton was one of those classic cases of many, multiple crossings. And so it was particularly difficult, or it seemed to be particularly difficult to safeguard motorists. So a basic map of Milton, so downtown Milton, the train tracks to the east of town, where down here. These are the 4 crossings and their 4 time periods that I want to think about now, all between late 1924 and late 1926. The maps you're about to see are from Sanborn Fire Insurance Company maps, which people are saying good, I've seen them. So I won't go into that, they're great maps. The first one I want to think about is a December 1924 crash that killed Williamsport brothers Ira and Harry Gare, aged 17 and 21. Harry, the older, was driving a truck loaded with meat from the Peters packing plant in Williamsport. It was destined for the Hertz meat factory or plant in town. It was 11 o'clock in the morning, and Harry was driving down Walnut Street. At the crossing of the Pennsylvania Railroad, the brothers were hit by a westbound freight train which smashed into their truck. The truck was thrown into the side of a house where it caught fire. Ira was thrown 40 feet. He died quickly of a broken neck. Harry was thrown a shorter distance, but he too had extensive injuries. He fractured his skull in 3 places. He died that day in the Williamsport Hospital. Fred Gottcharles, the editor of the newspaper The Miltonian, noted that this Walnut Street crossing had seen its share of accidents in 1912 and 1922, for example. There was not a watchman, a railroad watchman, at the crossing, and drivers and pedestrians were expected to take precautions as they approached and crossed the tracks. The scenario of this crash was particularly tricky. There were actually 2 trains on the scene at that moment. There was an eastbound train, so east and west here really an eastbound train would be moving southbound in town. But an eastbound train had just cleared that intersection, and Harry had waited for that train to clear, but that departing eastbound train blocked the sight of the oncoming westbound train, and so he drove over the tracks. The county coroner, J.K. Fisher, held an inquest into these deaths, and the coroner's jury absolved the train's crew of blame. Harry Gare was essentially blamed for the accident, given that he'd started over the tracks without fully assuring his safe passage. The Miltonian noted the crash had prompted some changes. Quote, "It's understood that the billboard and other obstructions along the side of the crossing will be removed, and that a crossing watchman or other adequate protection will be provided at this crossing." It's not clear if the town, the county, or the railroad would pay for those things. It was usually the railroad company with maybe some sort of sharing by the town. A coroner's jury had censured the Pennsylvania Railroad Company 2 years earlier for the lack of gates at Walnut Street. Harry and Ira's parents sued the Pennsylvania Railroad 8 months later, asking $25,000 for the loss of their sons and the truck. Their case was based on the fact that there was no watchman at the crossing. Legally, the railroad had to put watchmen at crossings with a certain amount of traffic. This at this time was not a heavily traveled road, but construction that week on Locust Street had pushed more traffic onto Walnut, and And so they legally didn't have to have a watchman at the crossing, but that week they could have used it. 1 month after Ira and Harry Gare's parents sued the railroad company, another deadly accident happened a half mile to the south at the Mahoning Street crossing of the Pennsylvania Railroad. So I took this crossing today to come. 37-year-old wool mill worker Clarence Starks, his wife, 37-year-old shirt factory worker Elizabeth Starks, and their 9-year-old son Harry were killed when their Chevrolet was destroyed by a westbound passenger train at 1 o'clock on a Friday morning. Clarence was thrown violently from the car. Elizabeth and Harry were dragged a long distance in the wreckage. Area newspapers all noted 3 things about this disaster. First, Clarence Starks was evidently speeding. He was westbound on Mahoning Street coming down that hill, and witnesses said he was going too fast down the hill to stop in time. The Starks had left 2 younger children at home that night when they took Harry to Lewisburg, and there was much guessing that they were racing home or rushing home to get to the kids. The train's firemen testified to the coroner's jury that the car shot into the crossing without warning. Secondly, the newspapers reported that there was no watchman at the crossing either. The Pennsylvania Railroad stationed a watchman until 10 p.m. at night at this intersection. The Miltonian referred to the intersection as the Death Crossing. There had been a non-fatal accident there just earlier in the year. Third, the passenger train was running 11 minutes late on its way from Sunbury to Williamsport. And when newspaper writers mentioned that, they were tended to mention that to imply that the train was moving faster than it should have been to pick up time and make up lost time. The fireman on the train said the train was moving between 30 and 35 miles per hour and that the warning whistle had blown 4 times. So according to the train crew, everything was working as it should be, or everything was going as it should be. 1 month later, on Broadway, it happened again. Just before midnight on a rainy, foggy Saturday night, a car with 4 men in it was hit by a passenger train en route from Philadelphia to Niagara Falls. 22-year-old Tillman Wagner, his 11-year-old brother Nevin, their brother-in-law, 29-year-old Floyd Hottenstein, and their cousin, 20-year-old Elwood Dye, were all killed instantly when the train dragged their overland touring car more than a block. Parts of the car were strewn on both sides of the tracks. The Miltonian gave lengthy, gruesome details about the physical damage to both the car and the passengers. They'd driven to Milton to purchase shells and tobacco for a hunting trip. One newspaper opened its story on this crash this way: the grim, swift death that stalks at Milton's grade crossings bore down once more in all relentlessness. The Broadway crossing had been the site of a crash in 1923, 2 in 1919. 43-year-old James Baker was the only witness to this accident. He was walking home when he saw the car start slowly over the tracks. The roar of the train came next. He said he never heard a whistle or a bell. The second fatal collision in a month prompted action. The Miltonian published an editorial titled "Protection Needed," in which they asked for watchmen at crossings 24 hours a day and the implementation of new electric signals to warn traffic about oncoming trains. Public opinion demands it, the paper said. A subcommittee of the Borough Council met with representatives of the railroad company who agreed to post watchmen 24 hours a day at Broadway and Mahoning crossings. Watchmen would be stationed for 8 hours a day during school days at Locust, Center, and Cameron. All other crossings would get electrical signals. The final Milton crash I'll talk about occurred 11 months later at the Cameron Avenue crossing, one of those that only had a watchman 8 hours a day during school hours. In fact, 20 minutes before the watchman would have reported for duty on Cameron, at 5:40 on a Tuesday morning, 70-year-old milkman James Campbell was killed instantly when his delivery truck was struck by a westbound freight train. The train was not scheduled to stop at Milton, so it was traveling at what the Shamokin Dispatch called a terrific rate of speed. And I wouldn't put too much in that. I mean, the Shamokin Dispatch writer didn't know, right? But the terrific rate of speed, that kind of rumor about what must have happened kind of spread easily via newspapers. The Miltonian reported that the Ford truck was a twisted mass of wood and metal. Coroner Fisher declared that this was not an inherently dangerous intersection, since drivers had unobstructed views well down the tracks in both directions. There hadn't been a deadly accident at this crossing since 1917. So taking in sum, like stepping back and thinking about these 4 crashes together, we can notice a few more things about this idea that I'm driving home, this idea of crashes being within these webs of social relations. First, there was a tendency on the part of the newspaper writers, editors, reporters, and we can only assume regular people, like non-newspaper people, to explain away the bad choices of drivers in those moments before they drove onto the tracks in front of an oncoming train. Those who had power or authority, or at least a voice, a platform, hoped to protect people from themselves, hoped to protect readers/motorists from themselves. This meant putting more responsibility in the hands of railroad companies and boroughs. These types of incidents were frequent enough that reactions became a little standardized. These are 5 more accidents that occurred during this time frame of 24 to 26. Not all of these were deadly, but these were very widely reported, heavily reported day after day. Cars and trains. State law required drivers to confirm that no trains were approaching before crossing the tracks. If they couldn't see because of an obstacle, a man-made or natural obstacle, the state law required drivers to get out of their cars and walk toward the tracks to make sure. This seems to have happened rarely in practice. In cases where people sued railroad companies for the loss of income due to the death of their loved ones or to the death of stuff, trucks, whatever it might be, the companies usually won the cases. It was difficult to show that motorists had done everything they were legally obligated to do at these crossings. Train crews always testified that they had blown the warning bells, whistles, they'd rung the warning bells, and so the burden of proof was usually too much for plaintiffs. But in the court of public opinion, writers tried to get readers to sympathize with the victims. Whether it was a sleeping child at home, a hunting trip to prepare for, or deliveries to make, newspapers presented the last moments of victims' lives as understandably rushed. Yeah, they were driving too fast, they should have been more careful, but we can understand what they did. Second, people got used to the danger of these railroad crossings and perhaps even desensitized to them. And all of these crashes, except for the one involving the Williamsport men, the drivers of the cars were familiar with these railroad lines going through Milton. Their everyday routine of crossing tracks made some people falsely confident, perhaps, about the lack of danger at any given moment. Some people knew the train schedules well enough to know exactly when the train should be there, but it doesn't mean the trains would be there on time. Or a special train, like that Niagara Falls bound train was a special. They could not be easily accounted for. Psychologists of the era worried that people might get too accustomed to the public dangers of living in an industrialized, mobile society. There was particular concern that drivers were lulled into complacency by the hum of the motor and the rhythm of the road. I find that a little bit comical because these cars would not be lulling people like we would gently. The rhythm of the road would be rough and the motors would be loud, right? But still, here were people who likely knew of the dangers of trains moving through Milton. Their carelessness in the face of that danger became an object lesson in the hands of newspaper writers. Even though the newspapers tended to side with the drivers when it came to these train crashes, there was a little bit of editorializing about the risk of being too comfortable behind the wheel. Drivers owed it to others, to passengers, to fellow motorists, to bystanders, to remain vigilant. So historians have tended to point to the countryside, rural areas, as the home of the first pronounced anti-car movements, shaking their fist at cars, and the teens, usually. These were mostly farmers and the teens who resented city drivers who motored out into the country, scared their farm animals with their motors, maybe crashed into their fences or stole some apples, and then left the scene. But in this area, particularly when we think about collisions between trains and cars, and I notice a little bit of a stacked deck, public opinion was not anti-car. Thinking about cars in the first 2 generations of the century could often come down to thinking about community, what people owe each other. Court cases in which motorists sued each other made that literal, but there was also a broader, more abstract sense about how small communities would operate once they were connected to bigger worlds through roads and cars. The carelessness of drivers was of a more explicit, contentious nature when it involved passengers in cars suing drivers who crashed them into something. Two examples of that, where a driver is sued by a passenger, show how relationships can be torn asunder by crashes. This takes us out into Northumberland County. On May 19th, 1929, a single-car crash occurred between Paxinus and Sunbury that killed a 9-month-old girl. Married couple Nick and Argentina Rovito sued their good friend, candy store owner Joe Vombico, for the death of their daughter. Vombico owned a 5-passenger Buick Master sedan, and on the day of the crash, it was packed with 9 passengers. There were 3 people in the front seat and 6 in the back. There was even a cat in the car. So it was raining as this group set out that May morning from Shamokin. They were on their way to Williamsport. Joe Vombico had agreed to drive the Rovitos there to see a nephew of theirs who had been hurt in a different car accident. Nick Rovito testified that Joe was driving too fast as they moved through Paxinus, heading westbound. He said he told Joe, you're driving too fast, you're driving fast enough to cause an accident. Joe replied he was a good driver. He said he had experience in New York City and Philadelphia, and that he could handle anything. Joe decided to pass a Dodge sedan in front of them on a straight stretch of road. The driver of that Dodge testified that Vombico blew the horn as he was passing. Vombico passed to the left on level ground in open countryside, but then turned the wheel too sharply to the right after passing. The Buick skidded on the wet road. According to Nick's brother, the front wheels went bum. The car shot on the roadside embankment and flipped over. Nick testified, as soon as he passed, we flew in the air. I don't know what happened after that. Everyone was either thrown from the car or pinned underneath the wreckage. Nick's brother said, you could not know it was a car. You would think they put off 3 boxes of dynamite underneath it. The doors came off, the roof was detached from the chassis, the radiator was pushed well into the motor. And 9-month-old Elizabeth Rovito was dead. Joe Vombico was shaken up but conscious, and he berated the driver of the Dodge for not giving way. In court, he testified that the other driver was hogging the road and kind of pushing him to the left, and that he had to compensate by turning sharply to the right. So instead of reckless driving on Vombico's part, in his version, it was reckless driving on someone else's part. The judge in the case explained to the jury that through a legal lens, that everyday act of piling into the car and leaving Shamokin was a crucial moment. He said, and I quote, the moment one enters the automobile of another for the purpose of taking a ride, then there is a relationship established. And that relationship is one of carrier and passenger. The kind of relationship that would exist is dependent on the circumstances and conditions under which the person got into the car or another. So he's basically saying, you set up something that's much bigger than just getting in a car. The second you get into the car, somebody else. Why you're getting into that car, how you're getting into that car, comes back to matter importantly. So the questions were this. Had Vombico agreed to take the Rovitos to Williamsport purely as a favor, as an act of friendship? If so, then he was responsible as a driver, only if it was proved that he was grossly negligent. If he was doing them a favor, then it's kind of on them. Or was the trip part of some kind of deal that they had struck, in which the Rovitos were going to pay him back somehow, even if they were just paying him back with another favor? In that case, Vombico was responsible for ordinary negligence. And if the Rovitos were giving Vombico nothing, just accepting a friendly act, then they were obligated to do all they could to safeguard themselves and other passengers while riding. So they carried a higher burden legally than if they had paid Vombico something. The accident and this ensuing lawsuit dragged the nature of friendship under the harsh light of the law. The Rovitos lost their case. And one can only imagine that a friendship that had actually started in Italy before immigration to the U.S. had ended over that deadly few minutes west of Paxinus. Coming back to the Milton area, we have a similar type of scenario that occurred 4 years later. There was a single car crash between Milton and McEwensville in July 1933 at what was called Dinty Moore's Curve. 40-year-old Sunbury resident Margaret Bassler drove a 1928 Cadillac with 6 other passengers on the way from Danville to Eaglesmere. Bassler had 15 years of driving experience. One of the other 6 people in the car was Florence Miller, Bassler's 26-year-old maid. She was in the back seat with Margaret's 12-year-old daughter Peggy and another maid named Alice DeWitt. All available space in the back seat was filled with goods, packed with goods, suitcases, a large box radio, jars and jars of cherry jam, cherry pies were in the back seat, packed. At the Dinty Moor Curve, a mile-ish north of Milton, where the road branched to head either northeast or north, Bassler drove too fast to stay on the road. In the crook of that Y stood a produce stand, which the Cadillac slammed into, upsetting a peanut roaster and a table full of beans. The car was stopped eventually by a concrete abutment. Bassler later explained on the stand she must have hit a small bump in the road, which started the car swaying just at the moment she attempted to navigate the curve. She testified, "It felt in the front of the car as though something was wrong with the road." Alice DeWitt suffered a neck sprain and a 4-inch cut on her scalp and was in and out of consciousness for a few days. Florence Miller had a skull fracture, an injured left eye and ear. Peggy Bassler fractured her pelvis. The operator of the produce stand, it was a real character on the witness stand, said it was such a crash-prone area that he was hardly surprised when Bassler plowed into it. He claims to have said, "Here comes another one," as he heard the tire screech. He turned to his son and said, "Here comes another one," and mayhem broke out. The father and son helped the occupants of the car, washing blood and cherries off the passengers' faces, giving them whiskey to calm them down. 5 months later, after they'd been fired from their domestic work, DeWitt and Miller sued Bassler for reckless driving. They sued them for their injuries and the loss of income. So neither of them could work steadily for the months after the accident, and so they were let go and they sued. They claimed she'd been driving recklessly. This case, too, came down to the nature of the relationship between the driver and those suing the driver. The maids claimed they were unwilling passengers of a sort, forced to go along to Eaglesmere for a week to serve their respective families, is either spend a week in Eaglesmere or on trial. Bassler's defense attorney disagreed, noting, and this was his surprise revelation, noting that the maids had gotten their hair cut as the party left Sunbury. They got their hair cut in Danville on the way to this wreck. And the impromptu haircuts had changed the route that Bassler drove to get to this accident site. And so the lawyer argued the maids were legally in charge of that trip once they got these haircuts. So they were no longer serving Bassler, but Bassler was serving them. She drove them to get the haircuts, and then they were proceeding. If there was reckless driving occurring, then it was their duty to make sure that it had been stopped. Margaret Bassler won the case. The Ravito and Miller cases show how the power and privilege of mobility came with the responsibility of having others rely on you. In the late 20s and early 30s, auto ownership was pervasive enough that most people were familiar with the operation of cars, even if a minority of residents had been behind the wheel and actually driven. In a packed car, the driver had a social duty to be alert, coordinated, and prudent. The physical and social effects of car crashes could lead the aggrieved to the courtroom thinking that they were going to be served as victims. It didn't always work out that way, but the morality plays of these accident lawsuits built a common refrain in the Susquehanna Valley when discussed and dissected in local papers. People let each other down all the time. Driving cars was just one more medium through which people could let others down. So the idea that malfeasance would occur in and behind the wheel should not be shocking to us. Like, this would not change the way we think about the world, nor was it really shocking to people a century ago. But as I shift gears here to get out of the car crash phase and more into the booze phase, I want to do a little bit of a reset. So let me reset the scene. If you were a Valley resident in 1925, let's say, if you were living here, if you read a newspaper, if you talked to your neighbors, you would know about this steady stream of accidents. You know something about this steady stream of accidents. You would know a lot about the small, frequent, everyday accidents, and you know something about these bigger ones. It would form a backdrop to your experience of the world, even if you weren't directly involved in any of these accidents. And you'd sense that more and more people were driving, and you'd even sense that more and more people from outside the area were driving through the area. There was a heightened circulation to the Susquehanna Valley at this time, in the mid-20s. That's hard for us to capture a century later. We kind of know that people are on the go. That would have been novel to people living here a century ago. So traffic certainly picked up in this area during the 1920s as the Susquehanna Trail on the west side of the river was completed. It connected Harrisburg to Williamsport, certainly, but it also connected New York to Maryland, upstate New York to Maryland, with what was, for that time, one of the most modern highway surfaces in the country. Traffic certainly increased. So here's a picture from Bo Fassel's photo collection of the Susquehanna Trail being completed just south of Selinsgrove. Traffic certainly increased on the west side of the river when the trail was finished in September 1923. The frequency of accidents seems to have increased as well. We haven't done a literal count, but the frequency seems to have picked up. Harrisburg newspapers were particularly proud of the Susquehanna Trail. They saw it as a way to further plug the state capital into the regional economy, as a jewel in their crown. And they criticized what they saw as inefficiencies in the trail. And one of the glaring inefficiencies of the Susquehanna Trail when it was first completed was the bridge just to the north of Selinsgrove. The Penns Creek Bridge, which they mentioned in this article. Another photo from Bo Fassel's collection. The bridge was, for our perspective, weirdly situated. It required a 90-degree turn to get over the river, get over the creek. So instead of moving straight through Selinsgrove and on northward as you would today, north of town you had to do something of a hairpin turn to the right to get across the creek. Then you would do another sharp turn to the left to continue going north. This turn right here was the site of accidents all the time. Most of them minor, most of them fender benders or cars crashing into the abutment. But during nights, and some foggy nights in particular, there were big accidents there. Cars moving way too quickly, not knowing that they had to turn sharply to the right. And so newspapers picked up on this spot as one of those weak links in the chain that was the Susquehanna Trail. And the newspapers reference at the very bottom there, you might not be able to see it, to strangers. So it says, the spot is dangerous, especially to strangers. That's important to note because there were more outsiders driving through the area than ever before after 1923. There's an anonymity to motorists when they become traffic, right? When the driver becomes traffic, there's an anonymity to that individual. And the greater circulation of individual drivers who are on business trips, or maybe commercial drivers hauling things between states or across the state, meant that this new thoroughfare opened up a different type of opportunity for people looking to lay low and make a buck. As cars made longer distances possible for the average person, one's social network expanded, but the demands of mutual trust and obligation that marked these small-town, face-to-face communities could not be maintained easily as the world opened up through increased car use. It was harder to know who was on the level. This leads me to bootlegging. The implementation of prohibition after 1919 drove the possibility of maintaining a double life. Just as saloons and clubs were driven underground in the nation's cities in the 1920s, so too was life in the countryside divided into its public-facing and backstage areas. Farmers with a ready access to fermentable grains had little incentive beyond their moral compass to refrain from making booze. Newspaper writers hinted that the widespread existence of stills in the woods of the Susquehanna Valley was an open secret. Editors tended to moralize about drinking, using the phrases whiskey crazed and rum raged to describe any violent offender who could be linked, even tangentially, to alcohol. And they seemed to also relish the unveiling of bootlegging operations, offering readers lengthy procedural descriptions of how people got caught. Cars were involved in the unveiling of these bootlegging operations due to the unpredictable nature of accidents. So if one was making alcohol illegally and hoping to ship it somewhere, the moment of transport was that tricky moment where things could be revealed, and we see some cases in which that was the case. So I want to give you a few examples. In January of 1921, a driver named James Swasley drove a truck full of 25 cases of whiskey into a tree in downtown Bloomsburg. 3 men jumped out of the truck and quickly got into a roadster that had been following behind. Only the driver, Swasley, was left behind. He fled on foot, but he was caught shortly thereafter. You can imagine that scene, right? Imagine that roadster. The doors open, people pile in, and it goes terrible. 1 month later, a rum runner named Thomas Healy was caught in a car full of whiskey when he ran off a muddy road east of Montandon and crashed into a tree. This incident, along with the Bloomsburg crash, led to the prosecution of several members of the Rosenthal blues interests in Wilkes-Barre. In 1924, an unidentified man and woman in a Ford Roadster overturned near Muncie after driving off the road. The couple fled, turning down the offer of assistance from a local resident who had heard the wreck. When the chief of police of Muncie came across the scene, he found 140 quarts of whiskey in the car. He had the booze taken to the Lycoming County Jail, where the sheriff was amassing a collection. In April 1926, last example, a man named Benny McLean skidded off a wet road leading into Sunbury and was picked up by the state police. In the car was 120 quarts of whiskey. This case had an interesting twist because after he was picked up and arraigned, McLean doubled down. He accused the police of confiscating alcohol for their own consumption instead of turning it into prohibition agents. It turned out he was telling the truth. McLean claimed that a year earlier, the previous summer, he'd been picked up in Williamsport doing the same thing, and that the police, instead of arresting him or doing anything to him, asked him to drive to this barn where he was unloaded, the alcohol was unloaded, and everything just got silent. He claimed that he'd been paying the Williamsport police protection money since then. 2 policemen were eventually fired for their hand in the Williamsport drama, but McLean was arrested for his hand in the Sunbury drama. So these are direct cases of car crashes leading to the unveiling of these shadowy underworlds where minor or major operations were happening in the illegal alcohol trade. The very last example I want to focus on today is a little bit more of a stretch. It's evocative, and I think it's pointing to where I'm going in the future, where it's not just about crashes necessarily, but the way that cars are involved in this illicit activity. But it does show how cars became involved in people's lives, and their hopes, and their dreams, and certainly in their secrets. So here goes. On Monday, November 26, 1923, little children playing at lunchtime recess outside the Aqueduct Hollow Schoolhouse, 2 miles south of Selinsgrove, came across the body of John Sanders of Aileen. Aileen's in the southern part of Snyder County. Sanders' body was in a culvert at the foot of Aqueduct Hollow, underneath the highway that had just been finished 2 months earlier. Hundreds of cars, maybe dozens, hundreds of cars would have passed over the body that morning on the Susquehanna Trail. Sanders had been shot in the heart, and there were no clues about why or how. A few days went by in which the county sheriff and the town constable made the rounds, asked the public for more information. Eventually, 19-year-old Francis Campbell of Verdilla came forward to tell the DA that early Sunday morning he'd shot over the head of a man who tried to hold up him and 3 other passengers while they were driving in a car. The 4 young men had been coming home from a dance in Port Trevorton around 2:30 a.m. There's another example of a dance that was possible for these guys only because a car could get them there. I mean, maybe they would have risked it in late night driving ride, but I don't know. So driving up Aqueduct Hollow that night, early Sunday morning, they found their way partially blocked by a truck loaded down with furniture. 2 men were standing a little further up the road, removing tires from a car that had been wrecked earlier in the day. Campbell and his friends, leaving this way earlier in the day, had seen the wrecked car. They knew who the owner of the wrecked car was, and they quickly knew that these 2 men were not the owner of that car. One of the men, removing the tires, ran off into the woods. The other one faced the travelers, shined a light at them, and then drew a gun. Francis Campbell had a gun of his own, in which he fired at the man. He says, over the head of the man. His driver, Campbell's driver, hit the gas. The car kept climbing out of Aqueduct Hollow. Campbell's statement to the district attorney explained that if he had killed Sanders, it was for fear of his own safety and that of his fellow passengers. If Campbell's shot did kill Sanders, then why was he found in a culvert? Doctors who examined the body said he would have dropped in his tracks, but here he was 30 to 40 yards away. A dirt-clogged revolver was found in Sanders' hip pocket. Police picked up well-known friend of Sanders, John Fulcrid, on suspicion of having robbed a hunting lodge in the vicinity of this alleged holdup. Furniture found at Fulcrid's house was identified as belonging to a hunting lodge in Aqueduct Hollow. Fulcrid explained he had been in the area that night, but he had only because his truck had broken down and that he was cutting a path through the brush to fetch water for his radiator. If that happened to approximate the path that somebody dragged Sanders' body down, he said that was a weird coincidence. The Evening News of Harrisburg took a generous view of John Sanders, who they called a wealthy farmer in Snyder County, suggesting that Sanders might have been killed while stopping John Fulcrid from robbing the lodge. So we stop right there for a second with this rather remarkable scene. The scene, I can see this in my head, and it's remarkable. Middle of the road, middle of the night, Sunday morning, slightly lonely at night road south of Sealands Grove. There are 3 vehicles on the scene, the car of 4 men who could only contemplate this late night dance because they had the car. The wrecked car that had been abandoned earlier in the day and now been stripped of its tires. A truck with this flatbed weighed down by furniture. It'd be hard to overstate how novel, how unusual the scene would have been to people reading of it in the newspapers that week in the area. More revelations were to follow, and they did no favors to Sanders' reputation. When the Sealands Grove constable searched Sanders' farm, he found rye and corn whiskey mash, 57 cases of dynamite, $1,000 worth of rope and road building tools, and hundreds of bottles of empty bottles that smelled like whiskey. The road building materials had just been stolen from the road construction crew that had built the Susquehanna Trail. No still was found in the area, 0 stills in the area, but the DA noted that Sanders was likely part of a whiskey ring. The dynamite had been wired to blow up if anybody entered the shed. That was a moonshining shed, a classic moonshining shed. Slain farmer led to life, screamed the Shamokin Dispatch. The uncovering of bootleggers like Sanders became a phenomenon in the 20s, usually occurring when local authorities or prohibition agents out of Philly or Harrisburg suddenly arrested somebody. The discovery of this booze paraphernalia and the stolen goods led local police to wonder out loud, did Sanders maybe get shot by somebody else in the underground economy? A rumor of other gunshots echoing through Aqueduct Hollow that night took the heat off of Francis Campbell. A Snyder County grand jury decided not to indict Campbell, agreeing perhaps with a newspaper verdict that Sanders got what was coming to him. And the chaos of that early Sunday morning in the Hollow was part of this new and messy world of bootlegging along a major transportation artery. In a plea deal, Fulcrid admitted they were there to rob the hunting lodge. On their way out of the Hollow, they stopped to get the tires because why not? And if they had not stopped for the tires, they wouldn't have been there when Campbell came through. It was, after all, an accident. So taken together, this ragtag assortment of stories, and it is ragtag. There's a loose thread holding them, but this ragtag assortment of stories adds up to a revealing picture of people coming to grips with a new material and social reality, a new consumer technology. Cars brought people together but tore them apart. Cars allowed people to pursue happiness but destroy other people's happiness. Cars allow for a freedom that can be dizzying. Within 20 years, increased motor traffic on an improving road system made the Susquehanna Valley residents confront a world turned upside down. Their responses were bureaucratic, sometimes melodramatic, but often bolstered by a belief that cars did represent some form of progress. So, the finale. Whether they were chiding each other for driving at more than 8 miles per hour down city streets, whether they were trying to convince each other that not everybody could drive down the center of the road, or whether they were wondering what was to be done with those kids, those wagon-bound kids who clung to the back bumpers of cars for a thrill ride. No matter what they were doing, locals were in the process of fitting cars into their lives and fitting themselves into a world that had turned toward. Thank you. Any questions for me, or anybody have things I should know that I don't know about driving? I know far less than I ever will know. Anything that you know about local driving in the early era, I'd be happy to hear about it. If you have questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Whatever you want to do. Yes?
I have two of them. The Susquehanna Trail, is that Route 15?
Yes.
Okay. And the bridge that you're talking about, Selinsgrove, is it the Green Bridge?
Yeah, so the Green Bridge replaced what used to be this awkwardly
Okay.
placed right-hand bridge. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Sure.
When were licenses required?
So licenses come in the late 20s and 30s. So cars from the get-go, by 1920, cars had to be registered. You had to have tags. But licensing came in the late 20s. Driver's tests and sort of training showing that you could drive as opposed to just being licensed. That's really a product of the 30s. Insurance was not mandatory, but auto insurance existed, and a lot of the best sources on crash statistics come from insurance companies who were actively involved in trying to get people to see this is a massive problem that you should know about. The individual driver could see the nationwide accident problem was something so abstract. So those insurance companies were trying to get people to think you're a part of this huge phenomenon that is killing people every day. But mandatory insurance doesn't happen even really by 1935, so I'm not actually sure when that comes into play. Most of these people were not insured. All of the court cases, insurance was never an issue. Yes.
I had a friend that was in an automobile accident on Brown Avenue Hill, driving backwards because his car wouldn't go forward. There was no dance. He had to go backwards up and crashed into the tree.
Yeah. And when would that have been?
I think it was in like 15, 16.
Yeah. The teens, and not to laugh at these because sometimes they can really injure people. The teens are filled with accidents of cars that are not making it up the hills because the motors can't hack it, and then they slide down, they roll down and hurt things behind them. That's a novel way to
This had the power, and it just the gas had to flow downhill, so gas was no problem.
Yeah. There's something of a charming, romantic nature to the mechanics of those cars, right? Where there were certainly mechanics in the area, but the notion of a car mechanic really picked up in the 20s. So before then, you were kind of expected to know what to do yourself. And so that was a good way of trying to get up that hill.
That was part of taking the driver's test. State police were in town. You had to be able to start out on the hill. Yet one of my relatives went somewhere, another town, because he wouldn't have to start out on a hill.
Yeah, I mean, one historian of car culture, car mechanics, says that really the progress over time of cars is a history of people not knowing how much they don't know. The forgetting, the collective forgetting. I never had to know. A whole lot of people 50 years earlier would have to know about cars.
They didn't have courses to go through town.
Yeah. I took my test on one of those artificial parking lot courses. They didn't really teach me a thing, but I knew exactly what I had to do to pass that test. Anything else? Other things you want to?
I don't know if anybody remembers the old bridge at Kingpin. My great aunt Jenny lived in West Milton and drove this big blue student figure. And when she passed away, when I was cleaning out the floor, it was completely filled with body repair bills because she apparently could not maneuver that curve.
And she tried to hide this evidence.
That curve was worse, I guess.
body shops and mechanics were really just blacksmiths, and people who would work metal. Because it was usually the axle, these heavy axles had to be replaced. And so the professionalization of mechanics in the 20s and the adoption of what we call car sales, car dealerships, that customer-oriented, like caring about the driver as a customer as opposed to you just figure it out, that's really a product of the 20s. But in the teens, and presumably one of the disadvantages for the man in the 40s even, you can just have, choose your own adventure. Yes.
There was a bridge up between Allenwood and Stewart that was really narrow. And they used to take kids up there and drive across to see if there was any traffic. And a lot of kids would stop. They would stop the cars because it was so narrow. You were afraid you were going to hit the guy coming the other direction.
That would have been a test?
Well,
Or test
some of us had
That's
said,
my dad took me the first time I let him drive.
my dad took us up there too, just to see if we could go across the bridge. But I think we already had our license or something. But anyway, that was one of the places we went for a ride. And that bridge was so narrow.
So it was technically possible, but it was scary.
Yeah, it was scary.
Actually, the driver registration from West Snyder out to Beaver Springs, kids up across that West Milton Bridge until it collapsed. That was part of his test, was to get him to make the curve on the bridge. My wife had to come up.
There were several wrecks in the teens and the 20s on the Susquehanna Bridge that now connects Shamokin Dam to Sunbury.
The old Bainbridge Street Bridge.
Yeah, the Bainbridge Street Bridge. Several wrecks where drivers just drive off the side. Usually during the night, and with a trolley coming across the bridge, they would panic. And those turn into these cases where the usually deceased drivers are found downriver weeks later. But the writing about the car crash then continues over and over and over again for those weeks. And so again, if you were this newspaper reader thinking about these things, even if you weren't a motorist, you were getting this sense almost daily of all of these things that could happen, weird and new ways that you could hurt yourself or others on area roads. So we don't think you're not driving. Yes.
My uncle, Amos Nyhart, he started driver training. He was a professor at State College. And his wife was Mary Helen Weinball. And she stopped driving because one day she was trying to reverse park, and she said there were some students watching her, and she said she was so embarrassed that she would make a mistake. She stopped driving.
Oh my God.
Social. What were the two names you said? Russell. What were the two names you said again?
Amos Nyhart,
Amos Nyhart and
Mary Helen Weinball.
making a mental index of names like that.
He bought land up there in, Route 45, coming to Goldberg, Camlin Acres. I don't know if you remember seeing the white fencing for miles. And they finally sold part of it off for a development, but it was a beautiful property. And Mary Helen was a poet, and she wrote, a book, and I think published it herself, but she gave copies to all my children. They were a really neat couple, and they grew so much of their own food. They would not buy bread from the grocery store. They brought it from a bakery. They made their own preserves and tried to live, a healthy life. But they had 2 children.
And reversing in a car for others.
It was a beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You said about accident with the train, it's like they parcel cars. Most of the time, the first line went through the parcel gates on it. They activated Pennsylvania Railroad. Yeah, yes, and no, it's the first one.
Yeah, those kinds of details, I want to, those timings matter. So those are the history of driver training and driver ed, the history of safety apparatus, all that ties into this story of how people are expected or not expected to take care of themselves. You know, the last thing I'll say is, driving in this area, since this project started, everywhere I drive now, I can kind of think, oh yeah, 1918, something wrecked over there. It's very weird and morbid way to drive around the area. But coming up here today, I was thinking, oh yeah, right, this, yeah, Georgia Northern Postcard, that horse accident in 1912. No way to listen. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you for coming. Get a reminder for your service as well. Fill that out. Basket. Also, if you're interested in coming to the annual tours, you all do there. There's a form out here, but I think also should be sharing online too. Oh, no. These are hard copy. Okay. Thanks again.
You're two.